You on, Rich?
Peace to the fam. Welcome to another fantastic show of Black News 102, Sarnetta Studios, House of Consciousness. I am Brother Reggie, and today I'm here with the great scholar, elder, Dr. Leonard Jeffries. And we are going to explore some of the topics that we talk about in the House of Consciousness. But before I do that, Dr. Jeffries, you recently attended the Sarnetta TV Awards. What were your comments about the Sarnetta TV Awards?
Well, I was glad that I was in town and I was able to attend, and I really appreciate what our brother Sarnetta was able to pull together with those around him that helped him pull it together, and I'm sure that you and others need to be congratulated. It took a great deal of wisdom and planning, but to make it actually manifest itself, it took a special blessing from the Creator, simply because so many spirits came together, so many forces came together to find a working unity formula. So I thought it was Pan-Africanism in its first working relationship. In other words, it wasn't Pan-Africanism of the Africans of the nations of Africa and the world, but it was a family relationship that was significant. And it was a mix. It was a mix of the entertainment, a mix of the scholars and the acknowledgement of the awards. And the one brother who was the comedian, I like to wake Dick Gregory up out of the ancestral realm and say, Dick, this brother stands with you. And it was good to see the various spectrums of the black community there, from the Nation of Islam and other Muslim groups, and from the Moors and others, the Hebrew Israelites. So
it was a unity event.
It was a unity event, and I was glad that I was a part of it. And so you're to be congratulated. But that's this year. So you learn from this year, and it's even bigger next year. And so just as we are about to have this particular imagery put on the internet, this, for me, it would be part one. And then we have to have at least part 1, 2, and 3 together.
So you're coming next year when we do it again?
I'll be there next year when you do it together, and do it next year. But I'm saying for us today, this is just part 1.
Right. Okay.
That we will have to have part 2 or part 3 to make it fit as it should. Okay. But to have that particular place where we had the affair, 95th, 96th, and Broadway, what I had prepared to say in my remarks, but of course we were limited in terms of the time, was special sacred ground for my wife and I. The Morningside Heights, that's where we met, 116th Street. She lived, and I lived right around the corner. Columbia University was where I was getting my degrees. But when we first got married, we lived on 102nd Street, which is just up the street from where the activity was. We used to walk down Broadway just for exercise. And so that is Morningside Heights. But if you go down the hill to 125th Street and then you go up the hill, you come to Hamilton Heights and Harlem Heights. So we spent a good 20 years in Morningside Heights and another 30 years in Harlem Heights. So that whole turf was a special part of our life.
City College.
Harlem Heights was City College. And so I'm thinking about a book. The Tale of Two Cities was a famous book that was written by the great French writer. I'm thinking about a book, The Tale of Two Hills, Harlem Heights and Morningside Heights, comparing Columbia University and City College.
Well, they attacked us in a book called City on the Hill. Do you remember that?
That's right. And so that's just one hill. We'll use that metaphor because there was an attack of City on the Hill. We'll use the metaphor of the two hills and the truth that came out of that. Columbia University represents the best of white supremacy, the most pristine of white supremacy. it is so pristine on that hill that it refused to move off of the hill and go out in the woods somewhere. They're expanding the campus and Harlem North, so that we need to study Columbia University. It is one of those 12 universities that was formed in the founding of America that was formed for money from slavery. So when I was taking courses there, I did not realize that. Now that I do have that history, because there's a book called Ivy and something else, and it shows the 12 schools, including the Catholic schools like Georgetown, as having been a part of this, financed and supported by the wealth from enslavement. So City College was supposed to be the poor people's institution. And so even though I had my degrees at Columbia, first went to Columbia in '61 after I came back from Europe, and I went to law school for a year. But when I was in Europe in 1959-60, I met Africa. I met Africa in the form of these young Africans and elder Africans who were there trying to find a way to African consciousness.
So, Dr. Jeffries, we are going to get into the Great and Mighty Walk Part 2, this time featuring Dr. Leonard Jeffries. But before we do that, Dr. Jeffries, we're going to have to tackle some really hard questions. Some of our greats are no longer here, but you were part of the greats. There has been a major attack in the last 7-8 years, seemingly after Dr. Joseph Benjo Cannon has left us, and certainly after Dr. John Henry Clark, is that people are now attacking. The first stage is that we did not come from Africa, Dr. Jeffries. We were already here, diminishing the slave trade. So you are the preeminent African scholar, both on the continent of Africa and in the Americas. These young people are now trying to say that there was a reverse slavery. Listen to what they're saying. They're saying that Europe went to the Americas first and got us from the Americas, right? And then they put us in Africa. They are seizing the opportunity to not do any scholarship or to misquote even white scholars to create this fantasy. There's a major attack on African peoples. So let's just first start talking about the notion of there was no slave trade. It was a diminished slave trade. The story is not right, and we are not the Africans from the continent.
Well, thank you, Brother Reggie, to bringing me on board in some of the conflicts and confusion that exists. We need to study our great scholars and their great works, not study a tape that they made or a speech that they made, but study their serious work. And one of the most serious that we need to put on the table is our brother, Dr. Wade Nobles, PhD from Stanford University. But his real PhD is in the African world. That's why I like to give out these PhDs for people who spent their life getting involved in the real struggle, which is not getting degrees from white institutions and get certification, but searching for the truth, working with those who found it, expanding it if you can with new technology, and then passing it down from generation to generation. Our great degrees should be given based upon intergenerational connection and learning sitting at the feet of the masters. And that's what I want to be able to put out as the contribution of the Jeffries Foundation. So the young man with me today has been with me for I don't know how many, 40 years almost, since the early 80s. And he has been at the feet of all of the masters and those who came on the shoulders of the masters. And so it is no question for me to say that he has earned a PhD in the African struggle the way no one else could have but himself. So we need to clarify that. that Brother Reggie is not here just to hand me the mic and ask some questions. He's had a life experience. I wish he would be able to tell a life experience, but he has his ego problems. He has a life experience that could not have been paid for. There's no price sitting at the feet of a Dr. Clark, a Dr. Ben, standing with Dr. Len and Professor Smalls. So it is not surprising that these new problems are arising, simply because we don't control the world narrative. And each group has a responsibility of coming up with their narrative. Unfortunately, each group has a limited view of the history, and they've wrapped their whole world narrative around that limited view.
Were we here already that before the slave trade? That is something that we have to flush out. You were talking about Wade.
Dr. Wade Nobles said, African people everywhere suffer greatly from a shattered consciousness and a fractured identity. Let me repeat it again. Dr. Wade Nobles, who has a legitimate PhD from Stanford University, but he has several PhDs in terms of the black mind and the black psychology and struggling in the black world. His latest great work is the Island of Mimes, M-E-M-E-S, where he dissects the Haitian Revolution in terms of the ideas and the consciousness of the people who were involved. And you can see the conflicts and the relationships and the continuity in terms of the Haitian Revolution. So our brothers and sisters who want to make the claim that there was an African presence in the New World before the African presence on the continent should point to the documentation and the information so that it can be evaluated scientifically. Scientifically, great brothers like Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, one of the greatest minds to walk the planet, the Imhotep of modern times, have established processing and synthesizing the data by the world of scholarship that millions of years ago, humankind began their march in the garden of the true Garden of Eden, which is the African continent. And those Africans who emerged millions of years ago and then became those Africans who were considered large brain humanity, Homo sapiens sapien, a couple 100,000 years ago. The first drama of millions of years ago, origin is in Africa. The later drama, 200,000 years ago, of modern humanity, large brain humanity, is in Africa. And then the drama that we now have benefited from the last 10,000 years, that drama was in the river valleys of the world. And the premier river valley was the Nile River Valley. And that is where the Kemetic civilization and structure, the Nubian civilization structure, the Ethiopian civilization and structure emerged. And so you have a million-year historical period that you have to relate to. You have a 200,000 years ago that you have to relate to. And 10,000 years ago, the cradle of modern civilization emerged out of the highlands and the lowlands and the rivers of the Nile and the Great Lakes region. So this is the scientific document that people have to contest. Not Dr. Jeffries, not Dr. Ben, not Dr. Reggie, not Dr. Rosalind, but take on Sheikh Anta Diop. I took on the responsibility of carrying on his work. So I was a Diopian before I was a Dr. Clarkian and a Dr. Benian. In other words, I met this brother in 1959 in Paris when he was taking on the intellectual tradition of the Western world that did not want to give him a PhD because his work was too revolutionary, too truthful. And that work involved the African origin of humankind. In fact, he had to present 3 dissertations, 3 doctoral dissertations to the French so-called scholars in order to get the doctorate. And the third time around, he wasn't going to take a chance. He had 150 of the brightest and best black men and women of good faith in the auditorium with him when he presented, and he was able to get a doctorate from the French institutions, University of Paris the Sorbonne. However, his great doctorate is not given by an institution from the Western world, just like my great doctorate is not given from Columbia University. I legitimately obtained that doctorate and a master's, and it was the The master's was the first in African studies from their new program. But my doctorate is in Black world studies. My doctorate is in field work. My doctorate is in sitting at the foot of the great masters. My doctorate is in living this knowledge. It's not coming from a classroom dominated by white supremacy. It's not coming from white thinkers or black thinkers who've been, unfortunately, miseducated by emphasis on what we call the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition as opposed to the deep truth. We have to do what we do based upon the deep truth. The other truths will emerge.
So there is a story of the peopling of Americas. I think Dr. Ivan Van Sertima wrote, and they came before Columbus. He started trying to talk about some of the stories around the peopling of America that may have had some African descendancy. But the issue is, Dr. Jeffries, was there a real slave trade? Were we already here? Why are they attacking the trail of billions of tears of people crossing to Atlantic under bondage and their descendancies? We are still crying. Why is there an attack? And the question is, I need from you, were we already here?
The answer is clearly African people are global people. So we have been in all parts of the planet first before anybody else. We are the founding peoples of the human family. They have found skeletal remains in South America, in Brazil, that date from 15 or 20,000 BC. So yes, there was an African presence in the New World before the so-called European enslavement. But that presence was the result of people coming from the mother continent, which was hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years before that. I was in Ethiopia with the leadership of the African world, 2,000 of us, and we were welcomed at the new complex aided by the Chinese and financed by the Chinese for the African Union. And the wonderful thing was these 2,000 plus great leaders were all there. And they all had to go into the Great Hall for their meetings. But they all were directed to pay homage to one of the mothers of the universe, Denkanesh, called Eve. No. What was that song by the Beatles or something? In other words, the remains of this find that's called Denkanesh. And the Beatles had a song in which they referred to her, Lucy. So in ordinary parlance and ordinary publications, the term Lucy was applied to this find. This find has been scientifically dated to have gone back to 3,800,000 years. And in fact, Lucy had made a 3-year, so-called Lucy, had made a 3-year travel throughout the world and all of the places for the world so people could actually see the physical structure of an African woman that dates back to the early times. And they brought those remains back and put it in the Great Hall. And every leader had to turn to, once they passed the security, they had to turn left and pay homage to Denkanesh, so-called Lucy. Recognition is universal on the African origin of the earliest of humankind. And so whatever was found in the New Worlds come in at a later period.
So I just have to clear something up for our audience because sometimes they're very general and they're not scientific. When you're saying that people were already here, you're not saying that first that they were Homo sapiens sapiens, and you're not saying that Lucy or Denkanesh is a Homo sapiens sapien. We're talking about evolution.
Yes.
Okay.
We're talking about the development of humankind over the millennia, over the thousands of years. And what this work, if you want to question any of the things that we have been raising, you have to get this work. when you get this work and you work through the first 150 pages, it's called the approach of paleontology. Paleontology is the study of ancient humankind and remains. And so what Dr. Diep does, he's speaking truth to power, to European power, to the European scholars and their tradition, which was the falsification of human history. And so he knocks them out, stamps them in the ground, dusts them off and say, get out of my way. He even shows the falsification of an ancient find, which I had to study when I was going through Colombia, Piltdown. And Piltdown was a hoax. Piltdown was the Europeans who have no ancient roots in Britain finding a jaw of a human and using, finding the skull of a human and taking an orangutan's jaw and attaching it and putting it in a pit and then discovering it. And it was all bullshit. I mean, it was all not correct. In other words, it was a hoax. A picture of the hoax is in this volume. But what Sheikh Anta Diep did for the first 100 pages is establish the African origin of humankind. We're not talking about large brain humanity. He's talking about the origin of humankind that emerges to produce large brain humanity, and that drama is in Africa. And he cites the facts and the dates. He takes on the tradition, and then he shows that there was an evolution of society in which large brain humanity emerged. And he shows a couple 100,000 years ago where that occurred and why it occurred. And he shows the illustrations, the artwork, the craft, the whatever mathematical formulas they may have used. And then he was able to go into our current period, which would be the last 10,000 years of humankind, where you can talk about civilization, high civilization, and culture. Dr. Noble said it best. African people everywhere suffer greatly from a shattered consciousness and a fractured identity.
These are the people that we face.
The attempt to destroy the black man or Asiatic black man, however you want to call it, to destroy his significance on the planet has been so successful that people will die trying to live that lie. And so bring us the evidence that would allow to contest. This work has been tried and tested by the best minds. Yes, there was humankind. There is a tape, because some people won't do the research, so they need to get a tape called The Skeletons of the Sahara. And that shows how this brother did a study of the Africans who marched out of Africa, marched into Asia, and then he traces genetic markers down into Australia and genetic markers over the Bering Straits into the Northern America. But we have evidence to prove that that was not the first time the Northern Hemisphere in the West was penetrated. So we will give our brothers and sisters time to do some serious research and find the documentation that establishes the origin of whatever you want to call it, the early hominid coming out of the mother continent. And it makes sense simply because there's no continent richer than Africa in any way that you can imagine. There's no continent that...
Did we come here, Dr. Jeffries, by the transatlantic slave trade, or were we already here? That is the question.
The question is being raised. It needs to be answered. Africans were all over the globe before the transatlantic slave trade. Africans or their cousins. So people are using the last 500 years when the European instituted the modern enslavement process to confuse the issue. We are saying clearly there's an African origin of humankind, and the mother continent for that origin is clearly Africa. There's an African presence throughout the globe, and that came in waves of migrations as Africans marched across the planet. All of the documentation, the scientific documentation that's emerging now, every day, every week, there's more of it that's establishing the mother continent, Africa, as the base from which other human developments took place.
Who are the Aborigine people? Who are they?
Aborigine is the name of indigenous peoples. Right. And so there's no name for people could be Aborigines of Asia, Aborigines of the islands of the Pacific, Aborigines of Australia. So that's a term that people seem to be using, and I'm going to pursue it even more because it's clearly an important point. The question of definition needs to be clarified. And you can say that at a certain historical period of time, there were people here. But if you want to look at the whole historical record, you have to include the whole historical record. And people have been chased away from what we're calling African peoples for a long time. And every new tradition or narrative that comes up has to devastate African peoples, either put a curse on them or either have them not really being human or fully human. And so, but the truth is emerging stronger and stronger than ever before. And so you can play games in terms of making parallels and comparisons, but you're going to have to deal with the reality. There's no people named indigenous. That's a term used for people who have long-standing residence in a place. They may say that the people in the islands of the Pacific are indigenous, but there may well have been peoples who came to those islands before. And so that term does not do the clarification that we need.
Okay, I may come back to this, Dr. Jeffrey, because it's an important point, that though...
You have to let our brothers and sisters know, you can't have a real discussion of these issues if you don't have this volume in your library, and if you haven't broken it down, so use it as the foundation from which other arguments can be made. And so the first 100 pages were so difficult for me when I went, and Dr. Clark gave me the mission. We can't wait another 20 years for this French-speaking version of Civilization Barbarism to come out. He said, you've got to go take a sabbatical leave and have it translated. And following my mentor, and I couldn't go in 81 when this book came out, because we were in the middle of following Dr. Ben to the Nile Valley. We were in the middle of setting up organizations like the National Council for Black Studies and other organizations. We were in the footsteps of setting up ASCAC, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. I couldn't go in 92. We were pulling our people together with major international conferences. But in 93, I was able to find the time to leave and then translate this book. And the first 100 pages, the first 100 pages is the scientific data that we need.
So, Dr. J, you're responsible for translating that work there, brother?
I was responsible for going to Switzerland and attempting to translate this monster work. And I worked at it, but the first 150 pages was scientific. So that meant I had to have dictionaries, and I had to have all kinds of things to translate this into scientific terms. I was in deep water, and I was trying to keep afloat, and then I got saved. Because the head of the World Council of Churches was Dr. Philip Potter, who was the boyhood friend of Professor Edward Scobie, who was my partner at City College and who was taking over the reins while I was in Geneva. And I had a chance to open up my mouth because the World Council of Churches is supposed to be helping the struggle in South Africa. And I made a statement that not enough is being done to help the struggle in South Africa. The world churches are talking his and talking that they need to do. So he put me in charge of the task force South Africa from the world churches. As a result, I was able to put this work up on the shelf and then get and write a volume which was South Africa in Crisis, which got the world churches to help all of the people in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, his wife came through the world churches. So we gave her aid so she could go back to South Africa ostensibly to set up sewing circles. They were really political education circles. So this work, since I started it, I had to complete it. And luckily I was able, with Dr. Ben's help, to meet a brother, Ngeme. And we able to get the first 100 grant of the Black United Front was $15,000, which we were able to give to Brother Ngemi to finish the work that had already been started. And we had to it had to be teamwork. He liked to work alone, but I said, no, brother, this is a teamwork effort. So we did it. So that's why there's an introduction of this work of 25 or so pages by Dr. John Henry Clark, the English, and there's a statement on the back by Leonard Jeffries. I'm the only one who's got his name on the back of this work, not because I paid to have it on. We're trying to say Diop offers a critical challenge to the orthodox scholarship of interpreting Egypt as a white civilization, which arose during the 19th century to reinforce, that's in other words, Egyptology, to reinforce European racism and imperialism, amassing evidence from the linguistic, from the archaeological, and from the historical to the philosophical, that demonstrates Egypt was a black civilization and that blacks are the rightful heirs to Egypt's proud legacy. Moreover, he shows through superbly detailed documentation that Greek civilization, long revered as the birthplace of Western thought, owes a substantial debt to Egyptian ideas and accomplishment. Massive in scope and containing more than 75 illustrations, Civilization and Barbarism will be recognized by the general reader and the scholars alike as an unprecedented effort to restore Africa's past and its place in world history. Diop's Civilization and Barbarism is truly an extraordinary scientific and scholarly masterpiece. It will undoubtedly become a classic of Afrocentric scholarship. Leonard Jeffries, Professor of Africana Studies, City College of New York.
All right, powerful. Yeah, Dr. Red.
And so, Dr. Jeffries, what you left out is that Brother Reggie had a role in producing the book because I was what? What was my role in producing the book?
Well, we were fortunate knowing that we need a family to work in terms of the education and the scholarship and development. And the
Get your water. We brought you some water.
Okay.
He left it in there.
Well, maybe a whiskey or some rum, Reggie might. We were blessed to have the generations coming up under us not only help us with the research, but help us with the technology. Brother Reggie, a student at City College, was into computer studies. And he was able to help us organize this great research, because it's not just a book that we're talking about. We're talking about looking at the sweep of human history and setting it on its proper course. And so we had people from the community, like Sister Lori, who used her translation skills and etc., and people with expertise like Brother Reggie, who was able to use his computer skills to help us put this documentation where it can be used. So the work of Cheikh Anta Diop is generational. Hold on to that, Reggie.
Upside down.
It's generational in the sense that Dr. Diop was inspired by others. And when I first met him in '59, I had a chance to meet his mentors. And the great Alioune Diop and his wife, Madame Diop, had set up a library and a cultural center in Paris. And while I was in Switzerland, I had a problem because all the Africans that I met who looked like they came from the heart of Africa was not accepting their being African. And when I ran up to him and said, "Brother, who are you? Where are you from?" He said, "Je suis français." And that happened over and over again. It got to be such a difficulty for me. I said, maybe some of these light ones I met, I can say, I find out whether they're African. And when I ran up to these light-skinned brothers, the same thing. "Who are you, brother? Where are you from?" "Je suis français." They were not from Senegal or Mali or Guinea or Congo. They were from Martinique and Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. They were from the elite of Haiti. So it was clear that what was happening in the African world was that Africans were being trained to identify European. And as a result, the African Foundation was not being fortified by the education of the European. So I did go to, Spirit told me to go to Paris. I did go to Cheikh Anta Diop's mentors, and I did meet them. And so Cheikh Anta Diop, as great as he was, pays homage to his great mentor. And I would just like to quickly read, and whenever I do something important, I like to read it. This work, Civilizational Barbarism and Authentic Anthropology by Cheikh Anta Diop, translated from the French by Brother Ngemi, edited by Solomon and Jagger of Lawrence Hill Press. What they don't say, supported by Dr. Jeffries and the staff at Black Studies and our students, including Brother Reggie. But this is a work of generational African consciousness. This brother, who was born in a Muslim tradition in Senegal, the Moorides, got the best French education from the colonies in Dakar, went on to go study science in France, got involved in all kinds of nationalist, Pan-African, Marxist-Leninist struggles. He's a mix of ideas that come out of the struggles that we've endured for the last 100 or so years. But he knew the friendship he had with his big brother was the most important thing. So he dedicated this book. I dedicated this book in the memory of Alioune Diop, who died on the battlefield of African culture. Alioune, you knew what you came to do on this earth. A life entirely dedicated to others, nothing for yourself. Everything for others, a heart filled with goodness and generosity, a soul steeped in nobility, a spirit always serene, simplicity personified. Did emerge, want to provide us with an example, an ideal of perfection by calling you into existence. Alas, the terrestrial community to which you knew how to convey better than anyone else the message of human truthfulness that sprang from the innermost depths of your being was deprived of you too soon. But the remembrance of you will never be erased from the memory of African peoples to whom you dedicated your life. That is why I'm dedicating this book to your memory in witness of a brotherly friendship that is stronger than time. Cheikh Anta Diop, Dakar, Senegal. It's important for us to understand that it is the relationship between families of scholars, relationship between elders and those who are coming into the process. And if we can't maintain that tradition that we've inherited, we will not be able to benefit from this enormous truth that has exploded in our world.
Give me the water, give me the water.
Okay, Dr. Jeffries, we're going to have to, this is a warm-up. We're going to have to move quickly ahead. We got some major themes to carry on. First of all, I want to let everybody know you have to support Dr. Leonard Jeffries. You can go to www.gofundme.com/Leonard Jeffries. www.gofundme.com/Leonard Jeffries. And please make a donation. It helps his work. It helps some storage issues that he has of this great material. Dr. Jeffries, they are saying again that we were not from, most of us, we were not from Africa from the transatlantic slave trade, though we may be African from an earlier time period. We are not those Africans from the African slave trade. We might come back to that, right? The other part of it is two major parts to this, Dr. Jeffries. One is they want to say now, they don't want to call themselves African or Africa because they believe that the name came from the Roman Scipio Africanus. That's what they believe, right? Now, I'm going to do a live stream sometime this week giving you the definitive case about that, but that's one of the issues I want you to gloss upon. So why don't we gloss upon that? Can we call ourselves African or Africa in the context of what they're saying that this came from European? What is your work on that? And then we're going to come back and talk about Dr. John Henry Clark. There's been some major attacks on Dr. John Henry Clark and yourself and others saying that your work, that Black Studies, Africana Studies, is CIA studies, not completely understanding the African Studies Association and the African Heritage Studies Association and what happened during that period. And you're the definitive person to do that. So, on the issue of Africa, the name Africa, what is your comments? And then we'll go right to the next part.
I understand there's a hullabaloo over the question of the name. But Africans are Africans by any name. We're talking about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. When he came into another level of consciousness and he was trying to develop it, he used the term Asiatic black man. That's still referring to the black people of the African continent and Asia, which are the foundation people of the universe. You can call people in Northern Africa Moors, but they still are the same people that come out of the continent. The indigenous people, as has been mentioned, in the New World, the later wave may have been those that came over the Bering Straits in North America. The earlier wave came through the South, and those people were what we would call Africans. What's in the name? It's a great deal if you have a negative connotation. What's in the name? It's a great deal if you have a positive connotation. Africans all over the continent call themselves by various names. In the highlands of Ethiopia, they had a name. In the lowlands of Uganda, they had a name. Along the Nile and the Niger, they had a name. And so we can fight over the name, but we're talking about the essence of the human family, which comes out of the African gene pool. The scientific and greatness of the human family comes out of the African mind and contribution. So that we'll continue this, and I'm sure that your piece will give us some clarity in terms of the misuse of the name in reference to Africa. Even our great Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen wanted to make sure that the name may have some clarity in reference to the indigenous Africans. So he came up with the Akhebalan, which fits as well as any other name, but it doesn't apply universally. And so we're talking about universally, that may be the struggle that we need to have collectively. We're talking about black people, Asiatic black people, African people, Akhebalan people, Egyptian people, Kemetic people, Nubian people, people from the Congo. That's that pool of the human experience that is ours. And you can't freeze it at a particular time in history and say this and that is what happened. So we need to have an approach to this. I'm sure it's going to be difficult because people don't like to give up the little bit of that little log that's saving them. And so they're hanging on to the log of limitation. And here comes a mothership coming to the waters to save us, and we don't have sense enough to grab a hold of the life rafts of the mothership, and we hanging on to a little log floating around into Neverland.
Okay, so recently there has been a debate with Dr. Ali Muhammad and our brother Jabari Osase, and one of the things came up is that black studies or Africana studies is really CIA funded, FBI funded, government funded, right? And that it is not good for us, and that funding found its way into the ASA, the Association for the Study of Africa. What is it? The African Studies Association, the African Studies Association, and that Dr. Clark, yourself, James Turner, and others must have been agents of these organizations because you was working to integrate Africana studies. So what is the real history of the African Studies Association, African Studies, the African Heritage Studies Association, Dr. John Henry Clark, what you did, the Black Studies Council, and others, right? Were you going to be white-led? What was the dilemma? Or was you going to take the discipline and make the discipline African or black-led?
Very important historical question that needs to be clarified. And fortunately, we've renewed the African Heritage Studies Association, and it's getting a new life. And so we need to appreciate this history. Dr. John Henry Clark, born in Union Springs, Alabama, growing up across the state boundary of Georgia into Columbus, Georgia, grew up at a time, he was born in 1915, he grew up at a time in which black people couldn't even go into libraries. He grew up at a time when there was an inferior education taught to black folks. But he let us know that the deep root of his learning comes from three deities that he had in his life: his grandmother, his mother, and his 5th grade school teacher, Eveline Taylor. And these important factors of his development, he wants to always honor, because they believed that he had the ability to be somebody, and they instilled greatness in him. So by the time he did get into libraries and he did get into the school system, he excelled in what we would refer to as American or European education. But he had such great understanding of his role and mission that he carved out a role for himself to deliver for us an African-centered way of looking at the world. And like no one else, he devoted his life to that. So that he used to be able to tell that he had to falsify a white person he was working for to get books out of a library. To make sure that that wouldn't happen to our youngsters, he devoted his life to accumulating the best library that any individual has had, systematically organized, maintained, and sustained. Even had 600 books up in one room, but devoted to a particular group. And Dr. Clark's legacy was able to be fulfilled in that when he left, Sister Sybil was able to, his wife at the time, was able to get 20,000 of his works out of his home on 137th Street, where we used to have our meetings, the meetings of the African Heritage Studies Association, the meetings of the various Black Studies Unity formulas, the meetings of the Pan-Africanists. When great African leaders came from Africa, those involved in revolutionary struggle and intellectual warfare, they would always go to Dr. Clark's house. We would always be there sitting at the feet of these great individuals. And so Dr. Clark fulfilled an enormous mission, and those of us associated with him understand what that mission was, and we can be very proud of what we did. People who have no knowledge of what was happening that time, were not there, had no personal knowledge of the events circulating around Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben, can make whatever statements they want to, but it certainly will not give us this enormous truth that we were blessed to have coming up from the bowels of the South, a person who could not even formally get a PhD or a master's degree because it was limited at that time. But he created his own self-taught knowledge, plugging into the greatest educators of his time. He had a mentor when he came to New York, and that was John Jackson. Professor John Jackson, a brilliant, self-taught, educated scholar, produced this great work, Introduction to African Civilization. And Dr. Clark wrote an introduction to that, just as he has written an introduction to a partner of his, a colleague in the struggle, Cheikh Anta Diop, just as he has wrote other great introductions to other great works. Dr. Clark needs to be seen as a catalyst who brought in the young. He had the young at his feet. He had those of us who were setting up these Black Studies programs. The integrity of those programs were never compromised. James Turner never compromised when he was a part of the African Heritage Studies Association and went on to Cornell to set up one of the best Africana studies programs in the world. Shelby Lewis, our great sister, is still on the case. She was coming out of New Orleans, and she was the secretary of the African Studies, Secretary of African Heritage Studies.
So, Doc, real quick, the African Studies Association
was formed in the 50s by white folks, and it was formed to provide information on Africa. It was not formed to aid the African world struggle. The African world struggle is emerging in the 40s and the 50s. In the 40s, it was emerged, Africans understood very well that they had to form a family of struggle. And so they met at Manchester, England, 1945. And who was there? Africans from all over. Who was the elder in the group? W.E.B. Du Bois. who had fought all his life to try to find the African truth, who was associated with him as the secretary of the Pan-African Conference in 1945. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who eventually went on to become the president of Ghana and lead the revolutionary struggle for freeing African nations, who was there from the Guyanas. You had Ross McConnell, who wrote a book, Pan-Africanism Within, who was there from the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago. Not only C.L.R. James, the great professor, but the great struggler and leader of Pan-Africanism, George Padmore, who wrote a book on Pan-Africanism and communism. Who was there with them? Jomo Kenyatta. Who was there? Nnamdi Azikiwe from Nigeria. Who was there? Great leaders from Black America. Who was there? Marcus Garvey's wife. Our leaders put aside all of the confusion and came together in 1945 in November and December. And that's an important pivotal moment because the Europeans had met, not in Manchester, England, but they met in San Francisco in June 1945. And they met in June 1940, the summer of 1945, to put their world back together again because it had collapsed with the destruction of World War II. And so they met in San Francisco, all whites from all over the globe, to put their world together again. And if any, very few blacks were there, or Africans were there, if any. And so the white world meeting to come up out of the ashes of 100 million white folks murdered or maimed. And they realized that in order for them to rebuild their world, they had to go to Africa. So the plan was for an Africa was going to be the base for a new Europe. And so they were not planning to struggle to free the colonies. They were planning to recolonize them with new technology. So that's neo-colonialism, the new colonialism. But these Africans, Africans from Canada, Africans from all over the Caribbean and Black America, they were meeting to map out a struggle for independence and revolution. AHSA, the African Heritage Studies Association, comes out of that struggle. We took up the banner from those brothers and sisters, whereas AHASA, the African Scholars Council, comes out of the CIA's knowing that they needed to have information on Africa in order to be able to tighten up the grip. We are part of the revolutionary wave. And Nkrumah didn't get his revolutionary consciousness in Ghana. He got it coming into America. And it was people like Du Bois and others that helped him when he went from Lincoln University in the 40s to Philadelphia. And then he went into a triangle of African consciousness that came from the New World African. That triangle of consciousness included Du Bois's presence and his Pan-Africanness in Philadelphia, and then Philpott, a friend of ours, a friend of Dr. Clark and others. Philpott would take Nkrumah down to Washington. And in Washington, he would take them right to Howard University. And at Howard University, they'd go to Leo Hansberry, to the Hansberry Circle. And who was there with him? Dr. Ralph Bunche had an office next to Leo Hansberry. Who came out of that struggle out of Howard? Greats such as Chancellor Williams, who produced masterworks on the destruction of African civilization and the 3,000 years of destruction and the rebirth of African civilization. And once this foundation of Philadelphia, Du Bois, and Howard University, Leo Hansberry, was in place, then Dr. Kwame Nkrumah came to the Big Apple. And in the Big Apple, he was there with people like Dr. John Henry Clark, by Willard Huggins, by John Jackson. They had the Harlem History Club. And so a triangle of empowerment for Nkrumah came from Black America and the Caribbean brothers in Black America. And then they were able to get their consciousness together so they could go on to do great things in the world.
All right, Dr. J.
You could go on for days if we sit here and let you with all this knowledge and information you got. We would like to know, and the young people out there would like to know more about you. If you can take me back as far as you can, how did you get started into all of this black stuff, this black African culture? If you can remember that. How did you get started into that?
Well, beautiful question. And let me answer it in the Jeffrey. Let me jug you a little bit. You know, in the old days when we were on the stoop in our neighborhoods, we played the dozen, and you know, we jugged each other out of love and affection. You have to do your research. I know you've done fantastic in putting us before the world, so many of us. But you're going to have to do research on the person who should be a special inspiration for you. And his name is, and I'm giving him his doctorate, an African doctorate in struggle and knowledge dissemination. Dr. Gilbert Noble. Gil Noble, who for more than 40 plus years produced the best program going across the airways on ABC TV. And you need to see us, Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, Dr. Amos Wilson, Regent Sanford, and Prime Minister, President Manley of Jamaica, Alex Haley. You need to see what Gil had done as the basis for you to even go further than you are going. And one of the things Gil would always ask me, the same question you asked, when did it happen? How did it happen? I say, Gil, you ask me this all the time. It happens back in my childhood, before I can remember. That, as Dr. Clark said, he had 3 deities in his life: his grandmother, his mother, and his 5th grade school teacher. Well, I've had that type of understanding in my life, that my mother and my grandfather, so we get entertainment in this area. My mother coming up from Virginia and her father coming up from Virginia provided that foundation for me before I was me. And in connection with the alignment of the stars, my grandfather was born. The grandfather was born January the 19th, 1888. He was born at the time of Marcus Messiah Garvey, but a little before. I later learned that my father's father was born in August the 10th, 1868. At the time, in the same year that W.E.B. Du Bois was born. I'm mentioning this to say that our people were farmers coming up out of Georgia and out of Virginia. So Booker T. Washington was the symbol of, for them, putting your buckets down where you are, getting control of your economics, getting skills, taking care of your own farming, handling your own finance and your own building. And so Booker T was what my grandfather was all about. But it so happened that W.E.B. was a part of the Virginia story.
But I'm talking about you. What's
okay? I'm trying to say that. I'm trying to say that.
Lead me out.
I'm trying to say. That's right. I'm trying to say that my pablum, coming from both sides of the family, was so heavy I couldn't be anything but what I am. In other words, I'm born on Virginia in order to do a study on the migration out of Virginia into Philadelphia. And that helped him produce the Philadelphia Negro, one of his great works at the turn of the 1900s. But Du Bois, while he was there, met these families and he needed a secretary. So my mother's great aunt, Pocahontas, became Du Bois's secretary. And so Du Bois wrote a study of Farmville, Virginia. In the back of his great work, you have a 38-page study on how he did the research. So what I'm trying to say is, Booker T was a part of the foundation. W.E.B. was a part of the foundation. And because in the 1920s Marcus Garvey came on the scene, the UNIA, Marcus Garvey is the foundation. So my pablum was Booker T, W.E.B., and Marcus Garvey. I wasn't raised on Dick, Jane, and Spot, Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella and the Seven Drawers. The first book I had, and I have it in the house. The first book that I was given, I have it in the house. A brown hardback cover, which I always thought was Booker T. Washington's autobiography. But it was missing for 40 years, and I finally found it, and it was in an envelope. My mother had written on it, because she saved everything. And it was the same brown cover, like the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery. But this, the title of this book, is A Child of Slavery. And it has the same pictures of Tuskegee, George Washington Carver, the scientist, the same pictures of the people required to grow your crops, raise your cattle, build your bricks, and build your buildings. That same process. So my foundation goes way back. From the very beginning, I've had this desire to be a leader. A young child, 7 years old, is not going to tell his people he wants to be the mayor of his town. That comes from sitting on the knee of something. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing said, we grow up by having what she called lap time. Somebody's knee that loved you and that put strength and consciousness in you. I complement that lap time with the Jeffries duality, Dr. Ben's polarity, with slap time. And slap is necessary because you need that discipline, you need that accountability. Lap and slap is what made Leonard Jeffries and his brother and the others that came up out of this process of Africanization.
Like I said, we can let him go on all day, Brother Reggie. Talk to us, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, about your first trip going back home to the motherland. Was it everything you encountered? Was it everything you thought it would be like? What was it like going back home for the first time, taking your trip to Africa? Because I already know you read all the books, you studied. What was it like for you?
Well, you had went to Europe first, right?
No, we talking about Africa, brother.
Reggie knows me better than you.
Reggie, oh,
so what Reggie wants to say is that he met Africa in Europe.
Go ahead.
And was the great awakening.
So yeah, talk about your first trip to Europe.
Right.
What did you say?
I met my first true blue African in 1957, 58. This was a young man who came to Lafayette College for studies. When I went to Lafayette in 1955, there was only two black people there. So, and one of them was a buddy of mine who I grew up with in Newark, New Jersey. So I had been accepted at all these Ivy League schools to help integrate them. But I went to Lafayette because my buddy on the block, Sonny Green, who we used to do the doo-wop and play drums on my sax, and he was playing drums. I went to Lafayette. There was an African who came there, and the head of the sociology department said, take this young man under your wing. And so I met a full-blown African at Lafayette College. But then I won the scholarship because I was one of the strongest students there. I won a fellowship beating out all the students in New Jersey for the Rotary International Fellowship. So I went to study in Europe. In French in international affairs in 1959. I graduated honor student. I went to Columbia University for the summer to take more French, and then I flew from the airport in New York to London.
So you speak
and then
French too?
Je parle très bien le français, presque comme le français. En effet, mes études de doctorat étaient faites en langue française, and that was my strength, that I had mastered French. I started in high school. I mastered it at Lafayette College. I perfected it in Europe, and so I'm the only one who was even capable of thinking of dealing with Diop's work. And so that's why Dr. Clark knew that strength, and so he had me. But in Europe, I met Africa in America at Lafayette College. Then I met it in a deeper way in Europe because it was clear that the mind of Africa was being shaped in the European mode. It was not being shaped in the African mode. And those who really, and I was surprised that there weren't more Africans doing that, but there were, but I didn't know them. I didn't know that Eric Williams was doing that in London under Lasky, who was one of the leading socialist thinkers. And so Eric Williams, coming with that Caribbean desire for education, and under the English tutelage of Lasky, he produced a PhD, which was Capitalism and Slavery. A mind-breaking volume, simply because it meant that the traditional way of seeing slavery was we needed to be slaves. We were inferior peoples. We sold ourselves into slavery. But when he put capitalism and slavery together with that socialist understanding of class struggle, that revolutionized the scholarship on slavery. I'm mentioning Eric Williams because he produced another book called From Columbus to Castro, which he made not detailed like the PhD, but for general consumption. So he took his highly detailed PhD and he came up with another volume that could help educate the masses of people. The same thing happened a little later, but at the same time I was doing my thing with someone called Walter Rodney, who comes from Guyana. And Walter Rodney, having also the socialist class struggle bent, produced a great work studying in Africa slavery in the Upper Guinea coast. That's Senegal, Guinea, the Gambia, Sierra Leone. And then that's his PhD work. But then to have it circulated to the masses of people, he produced How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Now, Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, Dr. Clark, Dr. Diop, we have been a family of scholars. We did not get into this thing of ripping each other apart. Even if there was a conflict between views, they handled it in a family way. That's the learning lesson.
Get to Africa, 59. How are you getting to Africa now?
When I first went to Africa, it was such a mind-blowing experience. 59, I met the great Africans, Diop and whatnot. It was such a trauma for me that I realized, and I have an article which I'll pack a packet of stuff, you'll get it later, a closer look at the world. When I came back, I was slated to go to law school because I wanted to be the mayor of my town, and then I wanted to be the leader of civil rights. 13, I joined the NAACP, so Thurgood Marshall was my model. So I was heading toward law school. I've been accepted at NYU, the only black person in the day session of NYU in 1960-61. But Africa had hit me in Europe. And then in 60, I went to Lafayette College for a football weekend. And my little girlfriend wanted to stay in the hotel. She didn't want to go down to the chapel because it was a student-run church, and I had been a leader of the student-run church. So I went down to pay my respects, and there was this white man sitting in his chapel house, and sitting next to him was a black man. And as soon as I walked in the door, the white man said, "That's the man for your program." And that was Chaplain Curry. He knew of my interest in Africa and whatnot, and so I carried Reverend Robinson's briefcase across the campus to speak in the chapel, and he laid out the challenge of Africa. 1,500 white boys and me sitting in that chapel, and I'm in tears because I know he's speaking directly to me. Our relationship became such that I knew I was going to Africa, but I had to finish out the school year in law school, so I have 1 year in law school at NYU. But he knew that I was the person he was looking for to be a part of Crossroads. So we developed this father-son relationship. I didn't realize in 1960 my wife-to-be had already been his program, and she went to Nigeria in 1960. While I was in Europe, she was in Nigeria under his program. She had been one of the people in his community-oriented church on Morningside Drive. And so when I went in 61, and it was a life-changing experience, when I came back,
Okay, keep talking.
when I came back, Rosalind was there to see the new crowd. And so that's when I met Rosalind. And then in 61, 62, 63, we were dealing with Africa. I was dealing with it because I was in the African Studies program at Columbia. So 1959, 1957 was Africa in my consciousness. 1959 was going to Europe and meeting Africa. 1960 was coming back and then meeting the brother who had a program of taking people to work in African villages, in African towns, to work with African youth, to work on agricultural projects, to work with medical. And so that old man from Knoxville, Tennessee, which is ironic because that's where Alex Haley was from, Knoxville, Tennessee, that old man became my father in terms of Africa. And my wife was already his daughter in terms of Africa. And then he married us. But what did I experience before I met Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben and before I met Rosalind? The most fantastic experience. That's why I name it and I'm claiming it. The real Black Panther, Dr. J. Because when I went, we had a work camp. First we went through the Azores. You had a 22-hour flight through the Azores. Then you skipped over Dakar and you flew into Monrovia. So my first night was in Monrovia, Liberia. And I remember it, Broad Street, and hearing James Brown music and everything coming out of the shops and whatnot. Then after we spent the night, then we flew on to Dakar and then down to the Ivory Coast. And that's where we spent the summer, Côte d'Ivoire. I'm looking at the little school that was built the year before. And that's what we were supposed to do, work on a school. But in the meantime, Ivory Coast was having its independence. The first serious independence was not in '60 because that came too quick for the African. A dozen African nations got their independence in 1960, and they weren't prepared for it. Nigeria got its, and that was July and August. Nigeria got its independence in the fall of 1960. My wife was in Africa then. It wasn't independent. She was there the summer of 1960 before independence, working on a school project in a little village called Ehamufu, which is near Nsukka, which is where they built the University of Nigeria, modeled after Azikiwe and others who wanted to have a land-grant college model for their universities, not an Oxford, Sorbonne, University of Paris model. And so the fact that my wife was there as the university was being planned was significant. We've been able to, from the 60s to now, you know how many years that is. Mm-hmm. So that's like the bulk of our life has been, you're talking about almost 60 years. I was 22 when I first went to Africa. I'm looking at a city, I couldn't even pronounce the name, Abidjan. And it's already there, for skyscrapers, highways, this is that. I mean, you talk about Wakanda. I said, damn, here's a place I didn't know exists. Being built from scratch. It started its big building from 1951 when the president, Houphouët-Boigny, told the French, too much of our wealth is going out to build the regional capital in Dakar. We want to have some of that wealth stay in our country to take care of the indigenous peoples. So the agreement was, okay, but in order to make the deep port, the lake, the lagoon, a deep sea port, they had to cut a canal. So they cut the Vridi Canal, which meant that you could have this deep water lake as a port. So from 1951 to 61, I'm looking at 10 years of development, stadiums, the port where you had just lumber, the cattle port. In other words, a planned nation was emerging.
And so you started to write.
Yes, and I have the notes of everything I did. That first year, I have notes on it.
Now, Dr. J.
And I have pictures of me speaking French because I was one of the only French speakers.
This became your dissertation.
Ultimately, I did a dissertation on the economic development of the Ivory Coast. But we did not, my love was not for the modern city, but for the village. Because it was the village of Local Joro where the group before us built a schoolhouse. So we were absorbed in this village in the middle of this modern city booming. And so that's why when I say I'm the real Black Panther, because I had to negotiate all of these heavy mover skyscrapers going up, but in the midst of it, we were in a village. That helped to transform my consciousness, because I said a year or so later, when I want to do my PhD, I don't want to do it from the big city looking out to the village. I want to do it from the village looking into the big city. And that's when I discovered the secret societies and all those things that have been put in place by this brother who was supposed to be a neo-colonialist, but he was a Pan-Africanist, approaching it his way. Next door you had an Africanist who was a Pan-Africanist, who got his Pan-Africanists from us in America. That's Kwame Nkrumah. So the two of them put a wager out. In 1961, there was a wager between them. I'm going to do it my way, which he eventually called state capitalism, controlling the state to develop the resources of the country and spreading it out to the villages. And Nkrumah said, I'm going to do it my way, and that's going to be with African socialism. And so both of them, in friendship, not in conflict, said, you try it your way and see whether it'll work, and I'm going to try it my way. And so from 61 I was in Africa, 62 I was there twice, 63 I was there 2 or 3 times, 64 I was there when Malcolm was there, 65 I was there after Malcolm's death with my new bride, and we were living there.
You was there when Malcolm was there?
Hey!
What was that like?
Hey!
Y'all together or y'all was on separate?
Hey! I was doing work. Malcolm was smiling and taking pictures. Hey, Malcolm was smiling and taking pictures. But Malcolm had done his work.
So you was there already when Malcolm came over. And you seen Malcolm and what?
That's why I need some help. All this money that you're raising for these dancers who do well, and these comedians who do well, and these other brothers and whatnot. The Jeffries legacy has to have somebody like yourself and a few people like yourself. Reggie has done the best he could.
Man, I'm willing to work with you,
look,
Dr. J,
look,
real.
1963 was the turning point of our history. Where am I? In Africa. How long did I stay? I stayed several months, and I went several times. Okay? Where was I in 64? In Africa. What was my role? Not to take care of Guinea. I had to take care of all of West Africa. I had to visit 13 countries in 1964. Where was Malcolm? He had done Mecca on the Hajj, then he came to Cairo. That's when he met the new leaders who had formed the new nation organization called the OAU, the organization. And so he went from Cairo across North Africa, past Nigeria, down into Morocco, and then on to Senegal, Guinea, eventually Ghana, and he went to Nigeria, and then he came, and from Ghana he made his return. I was covering that territory while he was there. I have the documentation. Wherever I went, I had to write the notes. I had to describe what was happening on the ground, who the leaders you met, could a project work. Malcolm's journal, which Herb Boyd and others put together to deal with Malcolm's journey in 64. I've read it, and I can see myself in the different places that Malcolm was. But I had work to do. I wasn't taking no photo ops. When you go into the Congo in 64, brother, can you imagine the Congo in 64? In other words, I can still see the European dogs who were left on the streets of the European quarters where we had to stay in these mansions. And these dogs had been left while the Europeans fled and went back home to Belgium. So these dogs were hungry. So I'm looking out the window of where I'm staying and seeing these dogs running through the streets. Usually when I go to a place, I walk out and try to walk around and see what. It was nowhere in hell my black buck was going to be eaten up by a pack of dogs. But I was there to evaluate to see whether we could have a project in the Congo. And it was too risky. So it was no way in hell that was going to happen, because Dr. Robinson said, don't fly into, we're not going to fly you into Leopoldville because there's disturbances. We're going to fly you into Brazzaville. So and then you can take the ferry across to Leopoldville. So they flew me into Brazzaville. I took the ferry across to Leopoldville.
By yourself?
Reggie, yes. That's what I'm saying. You all have missed the boat. I'm going to have a heart attack, and you're going to say, you know, this Negro had all of this stuff that nobody else has experienced. Nobody else is being asked to visit 13 countries and then ended off in the Congo by myself, with nothing but my pen and my notepad, and I took notes on everything. But when I went to the Congo, I met some friends. I met friends. I met Inez Smith Reed, who went on Crossroads in 1960 to Senegal with her no.
T. Washington didn't make it to those places.
Garvey didn't. But I'm saying I had to go with the Wakanda vision. I had to look at everything and size it and evaluate it. So what had happened was, I take the bark across, the ferry across. Brazzaville is supposed to be more stable. So while I'm in Leopoldville and doing an assessment, the UN had a concentration of administrators and developers there called ENDA, an Institute for National Administration. But some of my Crossroads friends were there. Inez Reed, Shirley was there. And if it wasn't for Shirley, I couldn't have gotten out of the Congo, because what had happened was there was a coup d'etat in Brazzaville. Well, I was in Leopoldville, so I could not fly out. The coup did not take place in Leopoldville. It took place across the river in the stable country. So I did get Shirley.
So who knows Africa on the ground better than Dr. Leonard Jeffries?
Very few people. Very few people. And it was,
Let me ask him.
It was very few people. Now listen to this. No, because I got to complete at least one of the tales. One of the tales. I had to figure out how to get out of Leopoldville to get to the airport. And because there was a lot of chaos, you had to be careful, because you could get killed or robbed. Nobody in the embassy was going to help me. They were there to protect the embassy. So Shirley had a yellow Volkswagen, and she drove me out to the airport. She risked her life.
You were scared?
No, I wasn't scared. The scaring is when I get out to the airport. I wasn't scared moving around Africa, because I had been used to that. My role was to go into trouble and take care of it, not to run from it. So what happened was, women driving in Leopoldville at that point are either the international community or prostitutes. Now, most people don't associate the international community with black people, but Shirley was an international working in development.
Now, I didn't hear you speak about Patrice Lumumba yet.
You're right. That's why I said this is just the beginning to let you know that if you don't have sense enough to get some of what I have experienced, when you go to your reward, I'm going to be up there in the African heaven where they got 72 virgins by some other people's traditions.
Right.
And I'm going to tell them no. All the people are going to be there saying he should be in, the brother did a good job, and Gil Noble said he was following my tradition. I'm going to say no. When he had a chance to really put something together for people, he was looking for entertainment, he was looking for conflict. He wasn't looking for one of the persons who have been blessed to have the most significant Pan-African experience in the history of the world. You hear what I said? That's why I can claim the Black Panther. I'm not thinking Black Panther in the sense of the movie. I'm thinking Black Panther when in 1922, when they discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, one of the images they had, Tutankhamun on a black leopard, holding the symbols of power. The black leopard was a significant symbol in the Kemetic iconography, in the Kemetic symbolism. So I'm saying a person like myself has had a chance to be in those institutions, not only the ones that were in ancient times, but the Africans have them now. The president of the Ivory Coast was not just a flunky for the French. He was involved in the Rosicrucian movement. Right, and the Rosicrucian movement was a modern-day secret society.
This right here. Let me bring it up to that. I know you want to stay with the African. That's cool, but I want to try to keep the young people out there entertained. Okay. Dr. Khalid Abdul Muhammad. Hey. Talk to us about Dr. Khalid Abdul Muhammad when you first met him. What went through your mind? I know you see this young man, you say, oh man, this man got the heart of a lion. Talk to us about Dr. Khalid Abdul Muhammad.
Well, I wouldn't give him that lion status.
Not yet?
No, because the lion was bold.
Wasn't
spoke
Khalid
his
bold?
No, Colin.
Oh, not Khalid, at the beginning. Okay.
Right. Khalid knew how to move here and there and come up. Yeah, he was a warrior. So the spirit of Khalid coming out of the various traditions that he had and mixing with the various traditions that helped him expand his consciousness, including the Nation of Islam and Honorable Elijah Muhammad, etc.
Studied Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark work.
Yes, but he was a partner of us. I have a picture in the house right there showing me holding out a poster of Marcus Garvey's institution. He's on one side grinning, and I'm on the other side. That was the last activity he did in New York before he was removed. I have with that a picture also is a picture of Marcus Garvey's son, Dr. Julius Garvey. And he has me on the stage at a conference in Philadelphia when he was trying to get the leadership of the UNIA under his father's name. And Dr. Marcus Garvey Jr. was a teacher of physics at City College, and Marcus Garvey Jr., when my wife and I wanted to walk, we walked past this street, 6 blocks over, to Hamilton, where Marcus Garvey Jr. lived. And when we knocked on that door, that wasn't on, oh, we got to clean the house. They said, come on in, and we stayed in there for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. Marcus Garvey's son is a personal friend of extraordinary. So Khalid was a colleague in struggle, but you could not, see, the lion would roar and know that he got it together, and everybody would be shivering. Khalid, he would roar, but he would do the leaping. He wouldn't let his roar, he'd be leaping. I saw Khalid leaping to the audience. Wasn't no necessary for him to do that. This was at NJIT. The NJIT, the New Jersey Institute of Technology, High Street, Newark, New Jersey. I'm going to be down there later today. Khalid made sure he had security. He was trying to get 200 of the brothers in there, and they compromised and let them have 100. Mm-hmm. The university knew this was going to be a big thing, so they had 50 to 100 security. So there was 150 security. Now somebody in the audience that Khalid wanted to stir up with, because he had a European with him, and he was asking some questions. Khalid jumped off the stage and went at the brother. Now that's not the lion roaring.
Right.
That's another feline.
Well,
take care of business.
He came to study Kemet. He was with the Islamic tradition, but he also
expanded. American experience is the Nation of Islam, is his working with the Minister Farrakhan. Mm-hmm. For him, an antithesis was this revolutionary struggle that he adopted. The nation approaches struggle differently, and so Khalid branched out to do his thing. He maintained his respect for the nation, But he
Give
was
us your
doing his thing.
paralysis of analysis.
But Khalid,
That's your stuff.
based upon Khalid,
All right, go, Dave.
based upon Khalid Muhammad's experience, he would have created a synthesis that includes the teachings of the nation, that includes the Black Panther, if you will, the revolutionary, and that would include a synthesis of that. And so that...
They don't understand. Theses.
Oh, theses is the beginning, the foundation. The antithesis is the opposite. Life is based upon the law of opposites. That's the great teachings of Dr. Ben, getting it from the Nile. But people say, Dr. J, you're talking about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You're taking that from the Greeks. I said, no. This comes in way before the Greeks. And then some people say, well, are you taking it from Hegel? That's the Germans. I said, no, it was in place thousands of years before them. The pyramid represents that. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And the synthesis is the combination of the negative. Now, I try to teach my youngsters to understand it in the sense that you are a synthesis. Your mother is the thesis. She's the foundation. Your father is the antithesis. They got together and had good sex. And as a result, you're the synthesis.
Good sex. Now, talk to us
No,
about...
the birth, not the good sex produced.
Talk to us about
But
when
that,
Khalid...
that good sex had to have the right ingredients. It had to have the 2323. And the synthesis of the 2323 is the 46 chromosomes that's in one cell that starts your life out. Your life is already mapped out in one cell with the 46 chromosomes.
So you believe in evolution?
I believe in science, Reggie. Science. Science.
Don't go too far, right quick.
Okay.
We're going to get to that. When Khalid Muhammad was suspended for making the speech he made at King College, how did that make you feel? Like, what was going through your mind when all this stuff happened with Khalid? Because history always have a way of repeating itself.
It was not a surprise. Nation has gone through all kinds of changes since the 30s. And then they had to go through some heavy changes in the 50s and definite changes in the 60s. So they like to have things organized. There's a program, there's a process, there's a philosophy, there's a mission. Khalid was a synthesizer on the spot. That's the way he operated. You see, on that cover of the magazine, where he's there with the rifle, that was not planned. That was something done instantaneously. That's the way he operated. But it was used by the enemy to put on the ventilated voice to say he's armed and ready for Minister Farrakhan. He did not have any arms ready for Minister Farrakhan. That was not the family relationship that he had. Those were arms for the system of white supremacy, the enemy of African people. But it was spun around to put them in conflict with the nation in ways that similar to we had with El Haj Malik El Shabbat. Now that history is history. We got to learn from it. And Minister Farrakhan is one of the best teachers. I've been with him all over the world where he's been trying to teach that we've got to deal with what happened, and we were in control of that, and we got to grow from that. I've been on the stage of the Apollo where he was reaching out to Sister Betty. I've been with him in Africa, in Ghana. I've been with Betty in Ghana when she was naming a park in the mountains of Uganda after her husband. So I'm saying that I see the family relationship, this great awakening. For me, 1945 to 1995 is the great awakening. That's the African Renaissance, or whatever you want to call it, the indigenous Renaissance.
Last question on that right there. Do you think Dr. Khalid Abdul Muhammad was murdered? Biological warfare, by chemical biological warfare, something like that. No.
Because they worry too much about the struggle every minute of the day. And because they feel that they are supermen, that they don't have to eat. You got to eat. The Honorable Elijah wrote an early book, How to Eat to Live. In other words, you have to. If you don't eat right, you ain't gonna live. So our people need to have a program of self-development, family development, group development, organization development, community development, and then linking these communities up nationally, and then linking them up hemispherically, and then linking them up globally.
So the death of Khalid Muhammad, do you think
I can't say for sure because this society is capable of anything. There's at least 1,000 deaths of assassination that has been done by the enemy. And Patrice Lumumba was a perfect case in point. But there's a list of so many, and Nkrumah's nation was taken from him. After he had completed his Wakanda vision of a new city, of industrial development, a new dam, a lake behind the dam to produce electrical power. The people that financed it, they didn't want to have it financed as he had threatened to do, to go to the Russians, because they financed the Gamal Nasser Grand Dam in Egypt. They said, no, we'll help you. A consortium of Canada, the US, England, and France, and Germany put together the money. I was in Ghana in 1966 when the coup took place. I had made a 13-nation tour, again going all the way down to the Congo. And I told my wife, we're tired, we've been to all these countries, let's go home because we live next door in Ivory Coast and we can come back by road. So we flew out February the 22nd, or one of those days like that. And as we were flying out, I could see a stream of light coming from Tema. That's the auto road he built, linking his new city with the capital. And it was a toll road, one of the first of its kind in Africa. And then as we got higher, there was a burst of light. And I looked down, and that was Job 600. Job 600 was his plan to put the heads of state and make Accra the capital of the unity of Africa. And so he had these suites and then he had a hall to meet, and then he had an administrative building. That was his dream, he was a visionary.
All right, now, Dave,
however,
I want to get through this before it comes down.
Okay,
So we don't have to rain.
however, friends had told me that he has left the country and he's taken 60 or more of his people with him, all the leaders, because he didn't have the type of trust around him that brotherhood should build up in. So he took the leaders. My druthers would have been for him to go to Kumasi and cement his relationship with Kumasi. He didn't do that. He actually flew across the country to Egypt to get a bride.
The Exodus.
And he could have gone to Nigeria, but he went to Peking because he wanted to be with the big boys and said that I've been able to pull it off. And that's when they pulled the coup.
Powerful. There's a young group out there that calls themselves the Amun Ra Squad. And they've been trying to teach our people about evolution, but whenever our people hear the word evolution, they automatically go all the way back to Charles Darwin. They say, man, we ain't come from no monkeys. We are not apes. We are not this. What is your understanding of evolution? Have Dr. Ben ever talked about evolution? What about you? Are you for evolution or what?
Well, that's the question that we started off with. There's a science to the world. There's great mysteries about life. And the more we are on the planet, the more these mysteries reveal themselves. And so our traditional thinking is stymied by people who have very strict religious beliefs that have to be expanded as far as I'm concerned, because you can have your religious beliefs, which is your spirituality, but scientific understanding of the movement of the heavenly bodies and your relationship in it, that's a deeper study that has to be undergone. We don't refer to Darwin as the person who saw a bit of that and may have documented. Africans understood it when they were along the river valleys in Africa, and they knew that the rainy season was coming. How? Not by somebody's script or something that they wrote, by studying the movement of the stars in the heavenly bodies. And after a period of time, you knew that when the stars reached here, there was going to be the flood, the rains. And then when the stars got here, after 4 months, the river's going back to its banks. And then you could plant your crop, and then when the stars are here, the crops would be bursting forth with a harvest. So the Africans were able to study the heavens and then see that same process taking place between man and woman. Man and woman are on the earth, but then they connect. Then there's a watering, the exchange of the semen. And then that cell impregnates the egg, and then the certain set of stars are here when they got started. Then as she grows with life, certain set of stars are there. And then when the harvest of life comes, certain set of stars were there. So Africans were able to relate the movement of this unseen, unknown cosmos with the movement of us on Earth. And that's when they could take their philosophy to a greater understanding.
Please, Dr. J, don't tell us that you believe that we come from apes.
No,
that we come from monkeys.
No,
because that's the first thing that the young people say. We ain't come from the monkeys.
No, and there's no evidence that we do.
Okay.
So whatever that is based upon is, again, what I call a paralysis of analysis. A little bit of information and you're ready to kill over
paralysis
it. Of analysis.
Break that down.
Paralysis of analysis is what Reggie and others were taught. And Professor Small and others sat in the classrooms and they picked it up and expanded. Systems analysis is the key. And using the triangle shape, you can look at systems. The equilateral triangle. At one polarity is what I call economics. Economics is the first principle of the universe. Economics is your creative, productive capability. Everything has to be creative and productive, otherwise it dies. So economics of producing to sustain family and community and society is key. But if you don't have the complementary part of the system, which is management capability, administrative capability, that's politics. So economics and politics are together. They have to be seen as the foundations of anything. The foundations of the cells of the body are related to economics and politics. The foundations of the movement of the heavenly bodies is related to economics of the universe and the management of the universe, which we can call politics. But economics and politics does not serve you well. Economics and politics, which is the foundation of everything, does not serve you well unless you have at the summit culture. Culture is the mind. Culture is the ideas. Culture are the deep thoughts and whatnot. Culture tells you what type of economics to develop and who to do your politics with. Unless we have that type of system in place, we're going to always be in confusion.
Now, real quick,
at every level. That's
now,
a blessing.
J, what I want to ask you is, before we get out of here, it would be remiss if I don't ask you this question. Mm-hmm. We talk so much about Kemet in ancient Egypt. How come we don't talk about the Dogons? Can you make a connection between the Dogons and the Kemetic people? Were they the same people, or?
They were related in terms of African, their roots, and it's in the book here, Civilization Barbarism. Cheikh Anta Diop deals with the role of the Dogon and different groups. So that's why if we don't have that as the frame of reference, we won't be able to dig deep in terms of what we need. The Dogon represents a fragment of our deep traditions. And so that we need to see all of that in connection with each other. So you can't take the Dogons and isolate them and say the knowledge that they had in reading the stars and conclude that they come from outer space. I'm not ready to go there yet. Mm-hmm. What the knowledge that we've uncovered as part of the human family comes from deep thought, deep analysis, going way back eons of time. And then we've been able to pass that knowledge down through the generations and through the eons. So all of these, when you discover something, like they discovered the Nama palette, and that became a key to unlock the culture of the Nile Valley. And so that Reginald she's probably agreed to say, no, I'm not going to say it, but she knows that we got to go down to Newark, my hometown. But what I'm trying to say is the various science, paleontology, now you have the technology coming from the computers, will expand and explode what we know. So we can't just sit there and say, well, this is the knowledge and it stops there. It's been blessed and the Creator gave us this. No, if there is a creative force that it will continue to give us the knowledge, and we'll continue to be able to use it, because we, as the creation, had this particular understanding. The lions don't have it. They may have strength. The elephants may have it, and others, and the snake. But we're the only part of the creation that has this particular ability.
You ready?
Yes.
Dr. Leonard Jeffries, this great work that we have been doing over the years comes at great cost. Enormous costs to our families, our finances. The attack is so severe. Seemingly, you were focused on getting this new information of Africanness to African people. We have been out of slavery only for a short time period, if you look at the way the world is, right? In this short period of time, since Booker T. Washington and others, we have made enormous steps. The oppressor seems to want to keep its status quo. Can you tell us some aspects of the fight that you had, the opponents? What was this fight about on intellectual warfare? Why did they, of all the scholars, why did it come to a point with you? Why were you singled out, and Dr. Clark, why were we singled out for this attack? Why do you think so?
Well, that's a key question that we have to deal with, and so we definitely won't be able to deal with it in its fullness today or any meaningful day. So that's why I said that for me this would be the introduction, and then we got part 2 and we've got part 3, which would make sense. And then any contribution that Dr. Leonard Jeffries would want to make, that's her decision. We've been on this journey together, and it's been a fantastic journey, but it has taken its toll. And we are now at the stage of 20, with the 4 score, we're 80 plus. So we've got to tighten up our contribution, and that's why we set up the Foundation Legacy, Dr. Jeffries, Rosalind Leonard Jeffries Foundation, to deal with legacy, because we have to figure out how to transmit this knowledge to others who are going down their path, and they can take advantage of knowing what the pathway was first.
That's important, because our young people have to know that this warfare is just not with police killings.
Right. There are several of our very important brothers who've learned how to lay out what the depth of the fight is. Because they're not the prominent figures, they will not be in the mix. But one of them was an obscure young man born in Mississippi with little or nothing but the miseducation that would come out of Mississippi. And then he came up to Atlanta, and then he got the Negro education of Morehouse, and then he went on to St. John's, or one of the Catholic schools in New York, and he got the Jesuit education. So out of that, nothing positive should have come in a significant way that would let him be one of our premier thinkers. But some force of Africanness became part of the brother's synthesis. And so he produced the developmental psychology of the black child. He produced the book on the awakening of the black child. He produced black on black crime about our young people. And so I'm referring to Blueprint for Black Power was his masterwork, and that was Amos Wilson. And so we have to understand that we need to study Amos and the trials and tribulations he went through and the formation he obtained in order to appreciate him. You cannot say that he made a statement or he was involved in this and then use that to analyze the whole sweep of his life, his socialization, his acculturation, his great awakening, and his continuing contribution by brothers who, for the last 20 years, he's been gone, 20 or 25 years. The brothers that he formed as a team are still producing his works and still perfecting it. So I'm saying that for us to appreciate what we had to go through, it wasn't a single individual. I was singled out because I covered a particular point. Amos Wilson was singled out because he covered a particular point. Dr. Khalid Muhammad was singled out for. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing was taken out of her flow because she covered a certain. So we have to see us all as queen mothers and warriors. But our
attack on an intellectual happened at City College against.
You sound like my public relations man, Rich.
But I'm not saying those. Yes, they had situations of loss in their jobs and things like that. The greatest intellectual attack happened in the New York Times, happened every day of the week in the Daily News and the New York Post about someone that they are now deeming a crazy professor who is one of our best scholars, trained in Ivy League schools, some of the best universities, right? That they send their own. They were questioning what happened to you. You were such you're going in another direction, our direction. Why was this attack on you? What did you say?
That's key and crucial to understanding who I am, what I've been trying to do, why my wife has been in the mix and started the mix when she first went to Africa. But that's not the question that we need to deal with now. That's the question that is so deep and profound that at the next presentation, we need to deal with this question of intellectual warfare, cultural warfare. And if we use the formation that I use, the pyramid, where you're talking about economics, politics, and culture, having studied all over the world, lived all over the world, I saw that formulation, economics, politics, and culture, is key to any system. You can't beat a system if you don't have a system. They have been able to control us, African people, black people, all over the world, indigenous peoples, by controlling our economics, and then having us play their politics, and then having worship and live their culture, so that we were breaking that. And it was a monumental break at this crucial time. 1945 to 1995 is a period of history that has to be studied by our people wherever we are. And in that time, you can fit all of the beautiful work of El-Haj Malik, El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, and the work of Minister Farrakhan, and the work of Khalid. All of it fits when you realize that this is where we are. Alex Haley fits in with the rest because he singly linked us physically to Africa. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois had been trying to link us philosophically and intellectually. And so our brother Sheikh Anta Diop completed that. Now, the interesting thing is that all of them operated as family. I know that more than most.
Okay.
Some of the rifts were very deep, such as the rift between, which happened with Garvey and Du Bois. But we have to use the 50-year turning point, 1945 to 1995. More significant events have been collapsed into that 50-year period. So this era is the era of Nkrumah, the era of Du Bois, the era of Malcolm, the era of our great sisters. And so our history is so deep, I use 3 historical eras as the key to looking at our history. The Queen Tea era, 400 BC to 350 BC. That's when the sister behind me and her great husband, Amenhotep III, and their family, including the Pharaoh Akhenaten, restored and renewed African culture and history. And they were looking for a special place, a special space, a Wakanda, a special community. And so that 50-year study of Queen T, the Queen T era, I call it, allows us to go back in history thousands of years to the founding of Kemet and go forward a couple of thousand years into what we call AD. So Queen T and her era, the era of Amenhotep III and her son and Nefertiti, that allows us to go forward and back over thousands of years period, using what they had in those cultures and making comparisons. Then you have to say, well, Dr. J, if we African peoples of color all over the world were at their high points, and what happened? Well, let's use the Columbus era to explain that. That's 1482 to 1536 AD. Queen T explains the BC, going back thousands of years. Columbus explains the AD. And the value system of the 3Ds, domination, destruction, and death, became prominent in the history of the world. And we've been trying to live it down now. The value system of the 3Cs come out of the African tradition. And that's communal, cooperative, and collective. Communal, living together. Cooperative, working together. Collective, sharing together. And at the center of that pyramid, I have what I call African spirituality, the ability to have spirit dominate materialism, spiritualism dominate materialism. In the Columbus era, you have the reversal taking place. You had materialism dominating spiritualism. The Europeans coming out of their icebox, looking for a way in the world, discovered by accident a new world, having discovered by circumstance and closeness and proximity Africa. So 1482 is the European first establishment of a trading post in West Africa that actually became a slave trading post. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue and discovers a whole hemisphere of people he wrongly names Indians, thinking he was in India. And so
He discovers for the European.
he discovers. And so we're living a whole West Indian, which is not real. It's a separate world that was unfortunately institutionalized on the wrong historical setting. In the 1500s, you began to get 1492, just that date, 1492, January, Granada falls, the last Muslim stronghold, Moorish Muslim stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula. 1492, in March, you have the Inquisition. The war between the Moors and the Catholic Europeans is in 1492 in a certain historical way. 1492, the war between the Jewish population and the Catholic populations are manifest because once the Catholics get control of Spain, they institute the Inquisition. Once the Inquisition takes place, which means that you have to be a Catholic or else you face death, and so you have to convert, etc. So a number of the population that had been Jewish in Spain converted. 1/3 was most likely killed, 1/3 converted, and 1/3 evacuated, and they went to other parts of the Mediterranean. But 1492, August, is Columbus being given the signal and the finances to sail the ocean blue, to possibly look for new markets. And so by October, he comes into this new world, and genocide takes place of the native populations in such a devastating way. And eventually, this new world discovery leads to the enslavement of African peoples. So that 1482 to 1536 is important because by 1516, you have the Asiento, the contract to take Africans to the New World. By 1517, you have Martin Luther opposing the corruption of the Catholic Church. So you get a new movement spinning off of Roman Catholicism named Lutheranism. And eventually in 1532, it becomes Calvinism. So we have to be able to see all of these historical movements in this one important period, which led to white supremacy. And so now we're in a period where history is turning its head upside right. And we are in a period where African peoples and peoples of color are coming into their greatness. 1945, they met in Manchester, a group, to think about what to do and to agree to have a union. And to have a union of people who might have been Marxist-Leninists or might have been socialists or might have been capitalists, but they knew they had to come up with an African solution. So the Europeans had already met to said that their solution at the UN, establishing in San Francisco the United Nations, that they could not do anything without the wealth of Africa. They needed Wakanda and whatever Wakanda could deliver to rebuild their world. But the Africans had made a pact that we were going to strive on another mission course, and that was going to keep Africa for Africans at home and abroad. So who was there in Manchester? Marcus Garvey's wife, to represent that. Some Africans said we need this unity for 100 years ago, and that was W.E.B. Du Bois. He had been with others who were thinking way back into 1800s that we need to have unity. So here in 1945, he's there. Padmore and Scobie as a Royal Air Force pilot, and Dudley Thompson as a Royal Air Force pilot was there. Azikiwe was there. Nigeria, Jomo Kenyatta was there from Kenya. And so George Padmore had an important role to play. And he was one of the leading world communists in the 1930s. He was on the Comintern, which was the International Governing Bureau for the Communists. And he realized that the communism had turned into not a class warfare phenomena, it was white Russian nationalism. And so he broke with the communists, and he wrote a great book, Pan-Africanism or Communism, which is a phenomenal analysis of someone who was in the class struggle movement, but then he got into the Pan-African movement, then he got into the nation building with Nkrumah in Ghana. So this is the type of, this 50-year turning point of history covered the bulk of my life, covered the bulk of Minister Farrakhan's life, covered the bulk of an important part of Malcolm's 15 or 20 years where he was moving into consciousness, covered Khalid's, and certainly covered my wife and Dr. Frances Chris Welsing and all of those sisters who got their consciousness. So we need to look at these three periods. Using a triangle again, one would give you the ancient history and its dimensions over thousands of years. The opposite would give you the establishment of the European system, symbolized by the Columbus history of domination, destruction, and death. And then we have now moved into a historical period of reestablishing the African Renaissance, the rebirth of Africa. It's based upon all that went before. So we have the capability of preparing a new world. And so we can have the conflicts, people can have different paths, but we have to find a reconciliation of the paths that we need.
Now, Dr. J, last question. You, Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, y'all brothers all in this room together. Have y'all got into any debates amongst each other, amongst yourselves, like discussions where y'all going at it in the room, like had these debates?
Debates are always there.
That y'all just, you know, everything.
Debates are always there. But the question is, what type of debates are you having? Are you threatening to kill each other? Are you insulting each other? No, you have African palaver. African palaver is a tradition in our culture where if there's a conflict, the community comes together. And core leaders in the community take the lead. And they have a palaver to deal, a discussion to work out the problems. And then when they come up with the solution, then they go to the larger community. And the larger community is roped into what the elder community thought they should have. And then the younger community is not sitting around playing football or basketball. Right. The younger community is sitting around watching this process take place. That we know how to solve a problem and how to work it out. My wife is heavily into the African cultural community. And she would, even these masks and these art pieces that you see in here, she got so heavy into that she will know if there was a conflict in some of the cultures, out would come a mass. And that mass would be, let's say, a judgment mass. There's something happening in the community that's eating the heart out of the community. and they try to solve it, but it didn't solve. So the people are gathered, and all of a sudden, out of the society comes a judgment mass, and that judgment mass is dancing around, and the drumming is taking place, and the person who knows who is the target knows that you better get your shit together, otherwise there's going to be death and destruction. And so we have to understand that this is not just art for art's sake, it's art for cultural development and whatnot. And so we can begin to discuss that. Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben had the most fantastic brotherhood. They disagreed on many things, but they would never let us see a fight between them. Wow. Dr. Ben's whole thing was, he could criticize Dr. Clark, but he loved him too much because they were coming from the South, Dr. Clark, coming from Ethiopia and the Caribbean, Dr. Ben. He felt that he should demonstrate to us this great love. So Rouse and I and hundreds of others were at the First World Alliance one day and one Saturday. And that alliance was set up in such a way that the men and the women came, people you would not expect to see running up to go into a church. They were running to be in there with us. The men got there first up the hill, so we had to set up a process where no man could sit unless the women are. So eventually the men said, let's not sit. Let's just stand around the assemblage as a protective warrior spirit over them. And at one point, Dr. Clark, he didn't prepare Dr. Ben for it, but he told them he had a special gift for Dr. Ben, and he had a ceremony right before our eyes. He took off his mystery system belt, and he put it on Dr. Clark, trying to say, brother, no matter what we may disagree on, we're brothers for eternity. And that's the tradition that they passed down to us. And if we didn't have that type of tradition, we couldn't keep organizations afloat. We couldn't contribute as we are now. Only Avife is coming here in a couple of days. They want us to be a part of that. I don't know whether my wife and I physically could handle it or financially. He's coming early in the morning. We'd have to be out at the airport. Then they're going to take limousines down to Baltimore, then down to Washington. We may have to say, we're flying down to Washington, and we'll meet you all there. Because they'll be so close-knit with this group of 40 or 50 people coming. They'll be speaking Yoruba. They'll be talking about some of the things they need to deal with. They want us there as the link with the African populations in America, but they have business to take care of. And I just talked to the brother today, and he said, you can join us, you'll be on the list. And I may tell him, we'll meet you in Washington.
Okay, well, you don't have to tell the world. Let me just close out.
Yes, let me thank Brother Reggie for hanging on and being there. We got to deal with his story. Brother Reggie was asked to be the leader of the Sons of Africa, and he did it very well. Mm-hmm. And he led a group to Africa in 40, what was it, Reggie? 86. Yeah. 86. He actually led a group to us in 86. We have the picture downstairs of our group at the palace of the Ashanti king. Then that prepared him for the big trip, which was next year. We took 1,000 people, 800 officially, and then 100 came. And he actually was in charge of almost 150 people on the Air Jordan flight from New York to Jordan to Kemet. And so he was baptized in struggle in the way that we couldn't have prepared it. We couldn't have made it easy for him. He had to absorb all the abuse and all of the, and it's still scarring him.
But you know, Dr. J, with Dr. Reggie, if he ain't talking about you and Dr. Rosalind Jeffries and Professor James Smalls and Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben, Reggie don't like nobody. If it ain't y'all true scholars, he says everybody else is like made-up scholars and pretend scholars.
Dr. Asa.
Dr. Asa.
No, but
the real scholars.
Right. No.
These new people, Reggie don't like these new people because they become
I like Dr.
religious.
They try to take Kemet and make it religious.
Well, since you set the pattern by having the awards where we come together to celebrate our difference and magnify it into our togetherness, then that's what you've set your journey on. I remember I was in one situation at the National Black Theater. I said, oh goodness, we're going to die up in here. I said, we're going to die up in here. And I was ready. My wife knows that And she said it not too long ago. He doesn't run from struggle. If there's struggle, he runs to it. So I'm saying you've set the pattern where different views can take place and some respect can be shown.
And so that's the time when I was at the mic with the Moors.
Yeah, that's
right. And we were in the middle, and we could see it. No, but if one punch had been thrown, people would have been killed.
Right.
And so that's why I said to Brother Small, we got to stay there to make sure that this conflict does not resolve, because it happens too often in our family. So I'm saying you're on the path. We need you to continue to do what you're doing, but you need to take the advice of elders, and you need to take the advice of people who you don't consider your elders, but they're your partners. And so you got a good partner here. You got the best that you could have. And okay, so however, he doesn't get the treatment that we need to give him. I can't do the way I want to.
Right.
I like to beat him on his ass and say, okay, brother, now you got a higher chore to go. You're ready to go even higher. But it's been a family affair. We couldn't have done it. But it's taken its toll out of us. And if we don't get support now at this juncture, we're going to be in trouble.
So,
it's for
Dr. Jeffries, thank you so much for giving us this time. There's going to be a part 2 where we talk about maybe the intellectual warfare. We don't know how you do it. You don't get the credit that you deserve, and your wife and your family. And so we're glad that you're here to tell these stories, these tales as you call them, right? To help aid the youth.
Right. The narratives.
So now we have to raise some money. So we have a GoFundMe set up. It's www.gofundme.com/Leonard Jeffries. It is the only fund that, besides the foundation, where the monies go directly to you, not to someone else, not to some publisher. It goes directly to you to help you maintain some records and do some of this work. And it's www.gofundme.com/Leonard Jeffries. If you wanted to be a part of the Leonard Jeffries, Dr. Rosalind Jeffries legacy, right? That's the way to be a part of it. You can call them. You have a number?
The number would be our cell phone, which is 201-668-7973. If you have any difficulties or you want more clarification, call 201-668-7973. And
that's not to waste Dr. Jeffries' time, to chit-chat. That's to ask him simply, where can I send a Western Union check? Right? That's not for holding him up and wasting his time. Dr. Jeffries, I got a question. There are lots of scholars under Dr. Jeffries that you can ask a question to. Please don't waste his time. But I know how you are, how you operate. Okay, Doc, so let's close.
I just want to thank you and Brother Sarnetta. But since my partner for life has arrived, and this is her sanctuary, I think she should say thank you to you for having treated me well enough, and I'm still saying, I know, I have that image of being in there, and you got all that.
Do you also know about 15 years ago, I forgot who was it that passed away, that you came to my house when I used to live in the projects, 133rd Street, and I think I made like about maybe 80 videotapes for you so you could raise money. You
okay, yes. Who
was it that
I'm
passed
trying to
away?
think of that.
I forgot too. I was trying to think.
Yeah.
Dr. Ben's...
no, it wasn't Dr.
Ben's. No, Dr. Ben's son.
No, it was 15 something years ago.
Yeah, that was
yes.
Dr. Ben's son.
Nah, man.
No, I'm not sure. But at any rate, we're gonna clarify that.
That though, right?
Yes, yeah. I do. But it would not be right for us to be in my wife's home and not have her say some words of greetings and giving us the courage to continue to.
Okay, so
she can come and sit.
Okay, she's gonna sit. She's more comfortable in her space.
Okay.
So we are so lucky to have at this time Dr. Rosalind Jeffries. So she just came in from her service for her special time that she has, which everybody knows, which is Sunday, and she's offered to give us just a few minutes. We will have Dr. Rosalind Jeffries on this show, and she has two great DVDs that she has more recently prepared, but she has much more material. So without further ado, Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, just for a few minutes, because we're going to have you come on and full. Tell the people who you are, your education, and what your specialty is in this work, because she's a powerhouse of her own. You've heard Dr. Leonard Jeffries for many years, but Dr. Rosalind Jeffries is the expert on African art, looking at African culture through African art. She is an expert in the Medu Neter, right? So she has lots of scholarship. Oh yes, she is. She's bad. And so here you go. Without further ado.
Well, greetings, Senator and Brother Reggie. I am really appreciative of the work that you have done with what was called wars, meaning bringing out and forcing out these big groups with ideas on their own religions, their books of sanctification, their travel experience, their unique little individualities, or else people would come together in small groups and kind of like die unto themselves. But we're living in a time where collective unity is far more important. And how so with us? Because we come from a people that dealt with empires and with nation building, the ancient empires of Ethiopia, of Kemet, of Mali, of Ghana, Songhai, the Congo empires. And so we were used to formats and formulas that were networks on top of networks on top of networks. And so thus that's why Marcus Garvey was not just alone, but he had a network of so many organizations.
And this, how do you know this? See, people talk that, but you actually have expertise. You actually see it in the culture. How do you know it? How do you know it?
Yes, you asked the question too about Leonard and why he was so much attacked. My idea is that it was gentrification. Gentrification. How can you have someone over black studies, the 22 professors and 60 courses on the book, and growing a department full of Africans, ambassadors from different countries, from Haiti, included the Caribbean, and African American? The plan was for those groups to fail, and for black studies to fail under it because of the diversity. And you found Leonard rising up almost more African than the African, with African names and installments. You found someone speaking French in Haiti and in Jamaica and on the radio, on the air, and people on the staff, as you know well, Brother Reggie, there were Haitian specialists in the department. And then certainly African American, Dr. Clark from Alabama, the Deep South, and all of that, right? So with a man could bring together all of that, and in their DNA is the concept that we came from nations and empires, out of which the ethnic groups, you know, that I studied formally, preparing myself to teach in museums and departments where you dealt with African culture and history. And within it, I went to find the deep root of God himself that branched out and could say, these are my people, these are Islamic, these are my people, they are Hindu, these are my people. Of all of these groups, these are my people who were lost, who will cry over them. When Harlem started to go down, I said, I'm a bad mother, because a good mother would have killed the drug dealers on the block. And you would have had no drug problem. And so that, how did you work within the Mende Sande Sierra Leone society? What was Telly Blackwater amongst them that produced fantastic mothers and women who were able to do tough jobs and do the economics from Mali, Ghana, and all of those areas coming through those trade routes. And so that there's another side of women and the collectivity on the small nuclear scale getting bigger and bigger and bigger until you have empires and kingdoms with women reigning. And so that's why I said black studies was a threat to the gentrification that we didn't know. As you know, Reggie, we never thought of gentrification in the old days. We just thought of moving forward and moving ahead. We didn't think about that the Harlem would look like it looks now. And so the people designing and planning, they knew it. We didn't know it. It happened in Temple with Malefi Asante and the gentrification. It happened in Detroit and all of these various places. So that there was a wave and a movement of things that we did not know of. And so that the economics and the politics, I say, is related to a spiritual movement of a God that's so powerful in his love. And why? Why do you love me, Lord? Why do you Because the answer came through to me, because I talk to God daily, because you're mine. Because you're mine, I created you and love you. Thus you see on the wall, and I'm not a specialist in Medu Neter, but I know enough. And so on the temple walls in Kemet, you see Mira, the glyphs. And it means to be like God. Why? Because I created you. I made you. And so within those glyphs and the writings, it talks about what the foundation of the universe and the world was like, out of which we came. And then the dissemination came forward into the various ethnic groups. And so you had the Dogon, you had the Bambara, you had the Miniaka, you had the Baga of the Guinea, you started to have the Bobo, the Bois, you started to have the inclination and the people coming together, the Pearl people, you end up having the Nok, Ife, Benin, you start to have the people of the Wi, the Guerre, and their relationship to the Baule, and then you had to have the Ebrier, and then you had moved on down, you had the people of the Congo, Bakongo, Babembe, Bachokwe, the Bakota, you start to have, I could go on and on and on, the Zulu, you could have the Song, the Twa, the Enu, I could sit here and rattle out the ethnic groups and tell you which ones of them believed in resurrection from the dead. And so therefore that's the foundations of the religions that had come forward and all of those things. So what is black about black? So in an era where you're having people say, I am the new black, or the new, I'm black when it's convenient, where you have people that say, no, I am no longer black. I am international. I am with the waves of the people and the drops of blood. Are you mulatto, not mulatto? Who are you? Are you black and yet not black? So to go back down to find out and tell you what is black from the origins of civilization and the God that was there, we end up knowing the essence of that mighty, almighty God. Oh, we love you, Lord, in return for the love that you have loved us with. Oh, we love you, Lord, because we didn't know to love ourselves without your love first. And so our tendency is to hate our own selves, to destroy our own selves, commit suicide. No. Please don't, because I love you more and more as you've come through these things.
Now, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked your husband. I come to you, me. I look you in your eyes and I say this to you. I am not African. I don't have no African blood in me. I was already here. My people are from the Americas. I don't have no African blood in me. What do you say to me after hearing me say this to you?
Well,
with knowing all the history you know about your people.
Well, David Imhotep and the British Broadcasting System said that there was a contingent that came from South Africa into South America and came straight on up. You see, and so that was a time before the word Africa existed, and so that they don't necessarily go back to the word Africa, but it was what I call the peopling, which is a whole discussion by itself. The peopling, to be fruitful and multiply and come forward, regardless of what names you want to call the continents, names you want to call this, that, and the other, and the ethnic groups that come out and to vie for each other, and the identity. The identity was first in the Supreme, and the Supreme that created the universe, and after the universe, or within it, was the planet Earth.
So it's the peopling.
The peopling, the peopling, and which is why I said the parent people, out of which, and very often, the children don't understand the parent, like the finite does not always understand the infinite, and so sometimes we call ourselves sheep.
Yes.
Sheep are dumb animals. Really dumb,
The parent people are born from where? Where are the parent people?
It doesn't matter where we're born from, but just we were born. And so that from the face of the deep, the sound and the word went forward, and out of the fruitfulness to come, go, and to be multiplied.
People
and
come from Africa. That's the question.
So the question is, the peopling existed before the word and the name Africa.
I agree.
Okay.
And we all agree.
Right. And where is that place?
It doesn't matter where it was on this planet. That's the key thing. So whether it was the continents all joined together in a Pangea, or Guantanaland, or whether it was a time when the continents decided to drift away, but we know that I'm talking about a God of eons of time of this planet and the universe, and so time frame may not have been the same if you're talking about infinite beings, finite beings versus the infinite, and so that the object is to connect back into the infinite as much as we can, so that that wave and power can move through us and miracles can be formed as they have been formed throughout the universe.
Dr. Rosalind,
are you a believer in the miracles because you have felt the calling and you followed the call, or did you deny the call because it was really too inconvenient? You might lose your job, you might lose your paycheck, etc., etc.
Dr. J coming down. Now, Dr. Rosalind, I'm glad Dr. J coming down, because my brother Reggie don't want me to ask you this question, because he's afraid I might get kicked out. Now, just like my
We have an engagement.
Yes.
Okay, we out. This is the last question.
4 o'clock in Newark.
Okay, this is the last question. Like,
It's after 4, see?
okay, cut it off. All right. Dr. J said he got to go, so we will have a part 2. Thank you, Dr. Rosalind.
And I'll just say, too, that Leonard is really a genius.
I know.
You know,
We know that.
don't find people who have a sense of time and data and information over the generations and over the time span of what we were talking about. So that's why when you get me talking about the infinite time before the word Africa existed. You get him, he's talking about time, so that there's a relationship between the Jeffries, the two, Leonard and Rosalind. It's kind of like on opposite ends, but moving together.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rosalind.
I'm giving Sonetta